There was once a small village on the outskirts of a sprawling forest. In this village, there lived a boy named Timmy. He was a happy-go-lucky kid who loved playing games with his friends. One summer afternoon, Timmy and his friends were playing hide and seek. Timmy found what he thought was the perfect hiding spot near an old well on the outskirts of the village. But as the game went on and Timmy failed to reappear, his friends grew worried. They searched high and low for him, but he was nowhere to be found. The villagers launched a massive search for Timmy, but it was all in vain. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but Timmy was nowhere to be found. One day, a villager went to draw water from the well and discovered something horrible. Timmy's body was at the bottom of the well. He had fallen in and drowned, and it was clear that he had been there for months. The village was devastated by the loss of Timmy, and for many years, they avoided the well, which had become a place of deep sorrow and pain. But as time went on, strange things began to happen. Every year on the anniversary of Timmy's death, a boy would drown in the well. It was as if the spirit of Timmy was exacting revenge on the village for failing to find him when he was still alive. The villagers tried everything they could think of to stop the haunting. They covered the well, filled it in, and even tried exorcisms, but nothing worked. Every year, like clockwork, a boy would drown in the well on the anniversary of Timmy's death. Eventually, the village became too haunted to bear. Most of the villagers moved away, leaving behind a ghost town with a cursed well. But even to this day, some say that if you visit the village on the anniversary of Timmy's death, you can hear the sound of little boys playing by the well. It's a reminder of the tragedy that befell a small village and a boy who never got to grow up. In a dense forest, far away from civilization, there was once a young boy named Jack. He was an adventurous kid who loved exploring the forest, often wandering off on his own. One day, while out on one of his adventures, Jack stumbled upon an animal trap. Curious as ever, he reached down to take a closer look. But as he did, the trap suddenly snapped shut, catching Jack's head. The boy's head was cleanly severed from his body, and his lifeless form lay still on the forest floor. But as the sun began to set, something strange happened. The floating head of Jack appeared in the air, glowing with an eerie light. From that day on, every night in the forest, the floating head of Jack would appear, asking for his body. His voice was mournful and haunting, and it echoed through the trees like a distant howl. The people in the nearby village who knew about the legend of Jack's ghost avoided the forest at night, too afraid to encounter the lost boy's spirit. But some brave souls who dared to venture into the forest after dark claimed that they saw the glowing head of Jack, still searching for his body. The story of Jack's haunting was passed down from generation to generation, becoming a warning to children to stay away from the dangerous traps that hunters left behind in the forest. But even to this day, some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the mournful cries of Jack's ghost as he searches for his body in the dense forest. James had always been fascinated with the idea of living in an old, deserted apartment. So when he stumbled upon a charming, Victorian-style building tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, he knew it was meant to be his new home. The apartment was cheap and came with all the essentials, but what made it even more alluring was the fact that he would have a lot of privacy, as there weren't many people living in the building. In fact, the only unit that was above his was abandoned. He didn't think much of it until he started hearing strange noises every night. At first, he assumed it was just the wind or maybe even rats scurrying around in the empty unit. But as the nights went on, he started to hear the sound of a kid running and jumping above him. It was strange, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. So, one day, he decided to investigate. He climbed the stairs to the abandoned unit above, but no one was there. The place was empty and covered in dust. Feeling a little spooked, James decided to call the building manager, thinking that there might be a rat infestation or something else going on. But when the manager arrived, he couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. Days went by, and the strange noises continued, so James decided to investigate once again. This time, he found something strange, a moldy wall. His instincts told him that it was more than just a rat nest, and he decided to get the building manager to help him knock it down. To his shock and horror, what he found inside was the remains of a little boy. It was a small skeleton, hidden behind the wall for what looked like ages. James called the police immediately, and they came to investigate. After a thorough investigation, they discovered that the boy had been missing for many years. They traced the remains to a family who used to live in the apartment many years ago. The boy's parents had already passed away, but the discovery brought some closure to the case. James couldn't believe what he had found, and the experience left him feeling uneasy. He eventually moved out of the apartment and never looked back. But the memory of the little boy who lived above him still haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on in that old, deserted building. Sophie was a young lady looking for a part-time job while studying. She was thrilled when she landed a job working the night shift at the 24-hour convenience store just a few blocks from her apartment. It was a perfect job for her since she could work while studying during the day. On her first night, Sophie found herself alone in the store. She was responsible for restocking the shelves, and she quickly realized that things were always missing or misplaced after she stocked them up. She thought that she might be imagining things, so she didn't pay much attention to it. As the night wore on, she could hear the sounds of children running around the store. She could hear them knocking into some of the snacks, but when she looked at the CCTV footage, she couldn't see anything. She tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the noises continued. In the morning, Sophie told her manager about what had happened, but he didn't seem surprised. He only told her to be careful and not to worry too much about it. On her third night, the disturbance was worse. Things started to drop on the floor, and Sophie could hear giggles coming from the children. She tried to ignore it and continued with her work. However, she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. She decided to leave and quit the job the next day. She asked around and found out that the convenience store was built on top of a children's cemetery. The kids that Sophie had been hearing were probably the spirits of the children buried there. She was shocked but relieved to know what was causing the disturbances. Sophie learned that the spirits of the children were probably trying to communicate with her. She wished that her manager had told her about the history of the store before she started working there. Maybe she could have been more respectful to the spirits and not be so afraid. Sophie moved on from the job, but the experience stayed with her. She couldn't help but wonder what other secrets were hiding in plain sight. Mia and Ben had finally moved into their new apartment after weeks of searching. They were happy to have found a place that was cozy, affordable, and conveniently located. But on their first night in the apartment, Mia started to hear some strange noises coming from the bathroom. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the sounds continued and seemed to be coming from the bathtub. Ben, however, was sleeping like a log and didn't seem to hear anything. So, Mia got out of bed and went to check out the bathroom. As she approached the door, the sounds got louder and clearer, and she could distinguish that it sounded like someone was banging on the bathtub. Mia was hesitant to enter the bathroom, but her curiosity got the best of her. She slowly opened the door and peered in, but as soon as she turned on the light, the sound stopped. The bathtub was empty, and there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused the noises. Mia was confused and a little scared, so she went back to bed and tried to get some sleep. But the noises continued, coming and going throughout the night. Mia couldn't explain what was happening, and she was too scared to wake Ben up. The next morning, Mia and Ben tried to figure out what was going on. They checked the pipes, the walls, and everything else that they could think of, but they couldn't find any explanation for the noises. They even asked the neighbors if they had experienced anything similar, but no one had. As the days passed, the noises continued to come and go, keeping Mia and Ben on edge. They tried to ignore them, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right in the apartment. Eventually, they decided to call in a plumber to investigate the pipes. But to their surprise, the plumber couldn't find anything wrong with the plumbing or the bathtub. Mia and Ben were at a loss, and they didn't know what to do. Mia and Ben moved out of the apartment and found a new place to live, but the strange noises continued to haunt them. They couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened in that apartment, and they were determined to find out what it was. One day, they decided to visit the local library and do some research on the apartment. After hours of digging through old newspapers and archives, they finally found a very old article that caught their attention. It was about a murder case that had happened in their apartment many years ago. According to the article, a father had drowned his only son, who was suffering from a long-term illness. The cost and stress of caring for the boy had taken a toll on the father, and he had snapped, drowning his son while bathing him. The boy had struggled and knocked on the bathtub in a desperate attempt to survive. Mia and Ben were horrified by what they had discovered. They couldn't believe that they had been living in an apartment with such a tragic history. The strange noises that they had heard were the sounds of the boy struggling to survive, and they had been haunting Mia and Ben all along. With this new information, Mia and Ben decided to contact the police and inform them about the murder case. They hoped that the truth would bring some closure to the family of the victim and that they would be able to find peace. In the end, Mia and Ben were able to move on from the experience, but they never forgot the haunting memories of their time in the apartment. They realized that sometimes, the past can have a powerful impact on the present, and that the truth can be both terrifying and liberating. Ethan drove through a neighborhood he had never been to before and saw a yard sale. He decided to take a look and spotted a pretty vintage doll that he thought would make a good gift for his 5-year-old daughter. She was delighted to receive the doll, but in the middle of the night, Ethan heard noises coming from her room. He went to check on her and found her sitting up, talking to someone while the doll was in the corner. "Who are you talking to?" Ethan asked. "My new friend Sophie," his daughter replied. Ethan didn't think much of it and put her back to bed. The next morning, his daughter was running around looking for something. When Ethan asked what she was doing, she said she was playing hide and seek with Sophie. Ethan went to work and didn't think much of it, until the same thing happened again that night. Noises of giggling and jumping up and down on the bed could be heard from his daughter's room. When Ethan went to check, he saw his daughter jumping on the bed and the doll falling onto the bed in midair. He was shocked. The next morning, Ethan quickly took the doll and threw it away in a dustbin on the way to work. But when he came home that evening, he was shocked to see his daughter holding the doll again. Ethan decided to bring the doll to the church and told the pastor what had happened. The pastor informed Ethan that the doll was possessed by a kid spirit. After a ritual, he left the doll at the church, and on the next day, he bought a new doll for his daughter from a departmental store. They no longer heard any strange noises from his daughter's room during the night. Jack and Emily were a young couple who had just finished their vacation and were heading back home. However, their flight was delayed due to unforeseen circumstances, and they had to find a hotel to spend the night. They were exhausted, and it was already late when they arrived at the hotel. The receptionist informed them that they would be staying in the room at the end of the hall. They went to their room, and soon after, they fell asleep. In the middle of the night, Jack was woken up by a sound of someone breathing behind his ear. He was startled because Emily was sleeping in front of him. He turned to see what was behind him, but there was nothing. Just a cupboard. Suddenly, the breathing turned into a whisper, and the voice whispered behind his ear. He felt his ear turning cold, but he did not have the courage to turn around. He could feel the presence of someone behind him, but there was no one there. The next day, Emily woke up and was puzzled why Jack had such dark eye bags. He had not slept the whole night. Jack then pulled the dark curtains open to let the sunlight in. To his surprise, the room was opposite a huge hill of tombs. They had not seen it at night because there was no light. The sight of the hill of tombs made Jack shiver, and he immediately decided they needed to check out of the hotel to find another one. He did not want to spend another night in that room, fearing that they might experience the same thing. Emily, who had not experienced anything, was hesitant to leave, but Jack was persistent. They checked out of the hotel and left, leaving the memory of the haunted hotel room behind. After a long day out, Sarah and John returned to their hotel room feeling exhausted. They decided to take a quick shower to freshen up before heading to bed. John sat on the couch, playing his favorite mobile game and chatting with Sarah about their funny lunch incident. He could hear her giggles as he spoke, but her replies were always, and, yes, with more giggles. As they continued talking, John began to feel uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He asked Sarah what they should do the next day, and to his surprise, the reply he received was, "You can come find me." He looked up to see Sarah asleep next to him. He was baffled. Who could have replied to him just now? John was so creeped out that he decided not to sleep in the room that night. Instead, he went down to the hotel lobby to get some fresh air. When he returned to the room the next morning, he asked Sarah when she had fallen asleep. Sarah replied that she had been so tired that she fell asleep as soon as she came out of the bathroom. John was even more confused now. Who could have replied to him last night? Feeling spooked, John and Sarah decided to cut their trip short and checked out of the hotel that morning. They never found out who or what had been communicating with John the night before. John was excited to start his college journey, and he moved into his new school hostel with high spirits. On his first night in the hostel, he heard a strange sound coming from the window. It sounded like something is knocking against a metal, but he dismissed it as the wind or some other outside noise. However, the same sound woke him up for the next few nights at exactly the same time, and he began to get curious. One night, he decided to investigate the source of the sound. He walked to the window, opened it, and looked outside. To his horror, he saw a figure hitting his head repeatedly against the lamppost across the road. Blood was flowing down from the figure's head, and John was frozen in fear. It was not a human, it was a ghost. The next day, John asked the security guards if they knew anything about the ghost he had seen, but they dismissed his story, telling him that there was no such thing as ghosts. However, John couldn't shake off the image of the ghost he had seen, and he started to do some research. He found out that a student had died in a motorbike accident in the same spot where the ghost appeared. The student had been rushing back to the hostel on his motorbike when he lost control and crashed into the lamppost where the ghost is at. The impact was so severe that he died on the spot. The ghost that John had seen was actually the spirit of the deceased student. John was both frightened and saddened by the ghost's appearance. He couldn't bear to stay in his room any longer and requested to move to a different room. The school authorities were understanding and accommodated his request. The incident left a lasting impression on John, and he never forgot the importance of safety while riding a motorbike. He also learned to respect the spirits of the deceased and to be careful of what he says about them. John hoped that the ghost of the deceased student would find peace, and that he could rest in peace.